This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Have you ever found yourself wanting to rock out to that hold music while you're sitting on the phone? I do it every Friday morning to this podcast. I swear the second that music hits, I start dancing in my chair waiting for things to start. Good morning, everybody. Truth seekers and true crime junkies. Nanette Bartow back here with another episode of Hit the Road Jack, Finding the Zodiac. Today, we are going to be covering more of the handwriting. I have a little bit of some research and some comments that I wanted to cover really quick first. We'll go ahead and turn to the PowerPoint presentation at this point. I did have two YouTube commenters, which kind of hit at perfect timing. They have been watching the documentary that Dennis Kaufman had done. And one of them, Skylar Lowry, about 3 weeks ago said, I followed this story for years, but after watching this documentary, I'm officially convinced Jack was the Zodiac Killer. Yes, Skylar, I believe that too. And we're going to be showing you guys today through the handwriting why it is that I believe that. Also, Rishi 5 days ago said, thank you. We finally know who this guy was. Again, this individual had also commented on Dennis's documentary. Last month, our stats and numbers were 63 listenable episodes, and we had 7,334 downloads. So obviously the motion is rolling. We're getting ourselves out there. We're getting this stuff heard, which is great. Today we have back again Nolan Del Campo. I'd like to welcome him to the show.
Hi.
Good morning. So one of the things I wanted to start out with really quick before we moved on was a summary judgment. I had I'm not sure who it is actually. Their screen name is Moonlight, has been sending me emails in regards to the hitchhiker murders. And they believe that they have some other suspect that's involved. And of course, they want me to read up on everything they have going on. Now, there isn't any handwriting in the hitchhiker murders, but Detective Brown from the Santa Rosa Police Department was very interested, as we heard back in those audio recordings with law enforcement and Dennis Kaufman, in looking into Jack. He's the one that compiled evidence on Jack through Jack's belongings that Dennis had, which included palm prints. I would like to see those palm prints, obviously, compared to whatever the Zodiac has on file. But I see that that's going to be a complicated thing because I did receive a summary judgment, it looks like here, you guys, and it is the case of Robert L. Bariff, plaintiff v. United States Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So evidently this individual had taken a case in order to compel FOIA, or the FOIA information, Freedom of Information Act, for those that don't know what that is, and was looking to compel the FBI and law enforcement such as San Francisco PD, Napa Police Department, Vallejo Police Department, to compel them to put forth the fingerprints so that they could make a comparison. The gist of this particular decision by the judge to deny the release of that information was wholly based on the fact that they claim that releasing any information in this case, since it is an ongoing investigation, would somehow hinder an actual conviction. Nolan, you took a look at this as well, correct?
Yes, I did.
Now,
it came out of the Eastern District of California, which is basically Sacramento.
Correct. So I was very, very interested in it, obviously. Now, of course, I think they're attempting to compare these two fingerprints of I know she had mentioned the name Borkin or something like that in one of her emails as to who they believed it was. But this being made known to the public obviously could assist many people to rule out their suspects and to move on, or to include. I mean, one of us are going to figure it out, because I promise you, if you call any of these law enforcement agencies or even the FBI, you're not only going to get the runaround, they're going to tell you they can't discuss it with you and they can't assist you in any way. And you turn over evidence to them to no avail, because it's not as if you're going to hear back from them that, guess what, it was a match. It's likely they're not even going to attempt to do it. But basically, did you see anything in there that gave cause for the judge to deny this particular request?
Yes, there's exceptions. The general rule with Freedom of Information Act requests is that the government has to show a compelling reason why they can't release the information. And there are some statutory exceptions. One of the statutory exceptions is that the law enforcement agencies involved feel that it will hinder the investigation and the capture of a suspect, that they can deny it on that grounds. And that's what they did in this case. They fell under the statutory exception.
And that makes absolutely no sense, because how could it hinder? I mean, the resources are being put out by somebody in the private sector. The match, if it's made, so let's say that they provided these fingerprints to this individual and they came up with a non-identification, and obviously that person would then just walk away.
Quite Orwellian.
Yeah, so it doesn't make any sense.
It's Orwellian. It's reverse.
And
it would help. It wouldn't hinder.
Right. Well, it would help people to move on, I think, those that have suspects that they believe are the Zodiac versus those that know that Jack, like I know Jack is the Zodiac, and we're going to get to that here any minute. But if I was to have those fingerprints and was capable of having well, I think they also stated in here that basically, unless you were law enforcement, you couldn't do an adequate job. I actually know somebody who had worked for law enforcement. Now she is in her own personal business, privatized on the private side. And so she's had many, many, many years of fingerprint examination. So it's almost as if they even used lies in this particular reason to do a summary judgment against Robert Barrett, because there are plenty of people who have spent a number of years in law enforcement and have completed these exams to the nth degree. They've testified to them in court, and they are very capable of actually doing that. And if they were to find a match, we would certainly turn that information over to law enforcement or to the FBI in order to confirm that match so that the case could be closed.
Right. And the other thing it could do, if they were to release it, it could help eliminate suspects too.
That's what I'm saying. It would help people to move on, recognizing that their suspect is not the person that they're looking for, at least not in regards to the letters or the Lake Berryessa crime scene, because there isn't a lot of places that I'm aware of that fingerprints are available from in the Zodiac case. Unless I'm wrong. I mean, there could be a lot of them out there, and they're just withholding that information from us.
And if Zodiac is eluded capture for this many years and is still alive, which we know he isn't, but or they aren't, how would someone, an independent person coming forward saying, I think this is the Zodiac, be any different than you coming forward saying, I think Jack Zodiac, or anyone else coming forward? Well, unless the FBI or law enforcement were able to corroborate that evidence. Then once you know that that's the person, you go get them. But it's a joke.
Yeah, and it kind of makes me feel like they already know who it is, and this is why they're not allowing the majority of the public to have access to this information, because they already know. I mean, why else? Putting it out there is not going to harm anything. I think it will just assist in facilitating, unless their egos are so big they just can't stand to have somebody else solve the case.
Right.
Okay, enough on that brief.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and get back into a full screen presentation of the handwriting. All right, so we're going to start with the letter B's today, and we're going to go across taking a look at Jack's B's. Obviously, we see this great big huge bubbly B that has an overhang to the left. It typically only overhangs on the very top side, not necessarily on the bottom side. He tends to close that in, but not really cross over to the left-hand side. We can see that occurring in many of the letter B's that we have here. And of course, that overhang that continuously occurs from pretty much just about everyone. Well, we do have a little bit of a crossover here on this particular B, but for the most part, the crossover happens on the top portion of the B. And then we can see as we get into it some more or some different forms of the letter B that Jack uses. And as I had indicated before, you guys, when somebody is disguising their handwriting, they're really actually just tapping into their brain and trying to figure out the way to form something without making it known that it's them. And so their first perception is the one that they use most frequently, or what they do the most. And that would be these particular B's right here in the very front of Jack's line. And as you get down, you start to see another form of that B with a very flattened angular top bowl and a very round bowl. We also see this little stem on the left side that pokes downward, and that happens in many of Jack's B's when he's not using this curved version over here. So you can see it, this tail that hangs down below the baseline, the angularity that's occurring at the top, all the way to a more irregular form, which is where the actual B buckle does not cross back and touch the actual stem itself, all the way up into what I call up there, or at least it makes me feel like it's more of his awkward buckle, which has kind of this open shape that is a little awkward and a little tremorous as it enters into the buckle and comes out. So one of the things I did this time in the handwriting as I was going through and preparing these slides is that I started to notate, if you see a blue circle, that blue circle then will correlate to another blue circle somewhere inside of the actual communications that are in question. And if it has a red circle, that means that somewhere inside of one of the question communications is also a match to another question communication in form and in style of letter B. If there is a blue and a red, which I think I might have started that after the B's. Oh no, here we do. We have over here, here's a blue and a red circle. A blue and a red circle means that it is both found in Jack's handwriting, and it is also found in other communications that are in question that we're talking about. So we're going to start our run through at this point. We do see that the awkward buckle that I have up here that occurs in Jack's handwriting can also be found in the Zodiac's handwriting. It can also be found in the Atlanta, Georgia handwriting. It can be found in the Oakland County child murder handwriting. We also see this buckle that doesn't touch back, which is quite like the buckle up here in Jack's handwriting down here in DB Cooper. When we get into forms that I thought were pretty much dead on, or let's take a look at this particular B here in Jack's handwriting. This particular B is extremely similar to the B's that are found in the Zodiac's handwriting. No, hands down, no question. Even the shape and form of that bubble pointing upward from the bottom, and then the angularity or the flattened top portion of that B that we are talking about can be seen. Now, when we do a crossover, of course, these stars indicate communications that have been completed or at least identified by law enforcement to have emanated from the same hand as the Zodiac. And those letters are a majority of the Zodiac letters, the Fairfield letters, let's see here, the Citizen letter, the Channel 9 newsletter, and the Sacramento letter. So I've starred these ones so you can already know and count on these particular letter forms are what we're looking at when we cross compare those to things like DB Cooper and Albany, New York, Atlanta, Georgia Killer, Voinovich, John Benet Ramsey, Scorpion, and Anthrax, Tom Voigt's letters, and the finale letter to Tim Miller, and a postcard or a greeting card sent to Bruce Ivins in 2006. So let's do a quick rundown on these letters, and we'll look at how the lipstick killer actually decided to disguise their handwriting. We see this very thin, long, elongated bowl shape that's occurring in these letter B's. And when you hopped over into Sherry Jo Bates, again, we saw the exact same style. So it is one thing that an individual would be identified by their natural handwriting, but I think even more identifying when it comes down to a disguise, because that disguise is probably not the same way another person would imagine or believe that they were disguising their handwriting when writing it. So to see that crossover into those particular letter forms is extremely interesting and highly identifiable. In the Elizabeth Short, I started to see these B's again with this tail or this stem that reaches down and the bee does not cross back over. And when I found those in the Elizabeth Short thing, and as I continued to actually look at other question documents in regards to other cases, I started to find those bees were made exactly the same way. So John Benet Ramsey, absolutely identical. The bee that is found here in Elizabeth Short is pretty much an attempt at copybook, but I found that that one was extremely consistent with a piece of wood that was found inside of a shed. The law enforcement in regards to the Grimes sister case, which I do have it in the PowerPoint presentation, but there isn't a lot of handwriting, and we're not even sure that this board that was found in the shed was related to the actual killer. But I thought it was extremely interesting that the style of bee that was used on that board in 1956 was extremely similar to that of Elizabeth Short in 1947. And we want to also keep in mind that time is a factor. So a person's handwriting can change over time, but what we're going to actually see is that in relatively close time frame between these communications, that the letter formations that are being used are extremely similar. So when we looked at these irregular buckles that did not touch back, we also seen those in Sherry Jo Bates. So there is another concept of disguise there. The individual thinks this is not how I write my bees normally, so this is what I'm going to use as a disguise. But we can see that those actual buckles and the shapes of those buckles are completely the same. When I got into the Dear Draft Board letters, we started to see things like this overhang that stuck out on the left-hand side, not on the bottom, but on the top. And we see this turn back in this particular letter B, which can actually be seen in Jack's letter B's. So we have two consistencies there. One, that the overhang on the top of the bowl passes to the left across the stem, and then that exchange and turn back into the next letter is similar as well. Now, the Zodiac Killer bees, when we get into those, I mean, again, we have this particular formation that I obviously found in other. Let's see if I can figure out where that one is. I wanted to actually draw lines so it would make it easy to cross-reference these back and forth, but unfortunately, once I started doing that, I started blocking some of the images, so I opted not to do that. So we're going to have to play the whole, let's figure out where it was again. By going down it. We already discussed these bees are absolutely dead on the bees that Jack makes, and that runs all the way through. And this one actually even has that overhang that comes back to the left from the stem. We have this very angular one that is found in the Zodiac and in the Channel 9 newsletters. So we have, and it may be that these are different bees, but they are similar. And that shows you why they made the connection between the Channel 9 newsletter and the Zodiac writing. Again, we have another bee with a very awkward buckle. We've got it coming off across the left-hand side, and we have the stem sticking down to the bottom here. This particular version, I believe, obviously he elongated the bull from the bottom, but it is very consistent as well with that letter B up there at the top of Jack's. Back into this particular version, we had, this one is extremely consistent with the B that the buckle does not touch back to the stem. This one I actually found was absolutely dead on. So if you look at this particular style of B in DB Cooper, we can see it right up here in Jack's handwriting as well. We get down into another B from DB Cooper, and we find that this one is extremely consistent once again with the formations that were found in Elizabeth Short, in John Benet Ramsey, in the Scorpion letters. I would love to get clearer copies of the Scorpion letters if anybody's in possession of them, because I know that these are a little tough to make out and read, but what we can see is that the bowl does not close, and the actual shape of that image is bearing pretty much in the same realm. In the Atlanta, Georgia Killer, we found not only one of these bees with the awkward buckle, just like we have up here in Jack's handwriting, but we also had this particular style of a bee, which I had found to be consistent. Where are you? Maybe it was back up here. All right, I'm at a loss for that one. No, right there, anthrax. So take a look at right. Take a look at the Atlanta, Georgia writings. Now this is both writings 78 and 81, but that particular bee right there is absolutely identical to the anthrax. What do you think, Nolan?
It's real close. The first one on the anthrax, the first two look more like 8s than Bs, but
Right.
you can tell they're trying to disguise their writing though.
Well, at that, and also we have to remember, we're not going to be looking at something that's absolutely identical. When I say identical, it's as close as it can be, since we never write exactly the same way twice. We can focus in sometimes on some of those differences, but we expect that to be a natural variation that occurs in handwriting. My supposition here is that we have both. The way that the actual bowl of the bee on the bottom is shaped is absolutely identical to the Atlanta, Georgia child killer, and the size and shape of the bowl on top again is exactly pretty much the same. And we have that heavier bowl on the bottom outweighing the bowl on the top, and that's what gives that similar look.
There's a lot of similarity with the anthrax and the Tom Miller and the I-45 stuff.
Yes. And I wanted to talk about the Tim Miller because here's the thing. Tim Miller received a cutout version of this letter in 2005, and he supplied that to law enforcement. Inside of a year, that letter went missing. I wasn't going to actually include this handwritten version in here because I wasn't sure whether or not, or where it emanated from, or whether or not it was related to Jack or the Zodiac. I do know that it was on the Image Shack website at the same time in 2006. It was put up there with the cutout version, and after I started this examination, I was going to remove it, but after I started the examination, I about fell out of my chair when I started to realize that there were so many consistencies in this handwritten version that it bears the fact that yes, the Zodiac wrote 2 and 3 letters every time he wrote something. Like Herb Cain, he wrote that letter twice. The 340 cipher or the 408 cipher, he wrote 3 versions of that letter. So 2 to 3 versions of the letters is a commonality with the Zodiac Killer and other cases like Sherry Joe Bates. So I had to then start just looking at what the characteristics of the handwriting in the Tim Miller letter was to see that, or even let's just look at it. I mean, we have this bee over here with this heavy overhang that comes across the back side. We can also see that the shape of the bee itself is very consistent with what we're looking at in Jack's handwriting. We look at this bee right here. This bee we just finished talking about, and I lost you again. Where'd you go? Yeah, I probably should have marked these, but either way, we can see the consistencies that is occurring. And if you look back and forth and in any of these that are inside of these red circles, you will start to see that consistency. Oh, here we go. So here's this one with this little tiny buckle. We've seen that happening up here in Jack's, and we also seen it happening down here in Tom Voigt's writing. We saw it, I want to say that I must have marked it somewhere else, but that's okay. We can keep on going. Everybody can take a look at this later anytime you want. Just kind of look back and forth between these particular formations and see what it is that I'm talking about. When we got into the Oakland County child murder, again, we see that stem that protrudes downward and sticks out. We have the unfinished touchback that occurs in Jack's handwriting. We can see that happening in places like right up in here. We can see it happening here where it does not touch back, here that it does not touch back, and here. So there are several instances in which that occurs. And now, of course, this is probably more what I perceive to be the copybook bee, or the attempt to make a more perfect bee. But even then, that did not deviate from what we're seeing in these other letter formations. The bee that is right here, this one is a great one as far as a comparison is concerned to what we see going on with Jack, because again, we have that stem that comes across, we have the tail that sticks down, we have that irregular buckle that I was talking about that you can find up here in Jack's handwriting. Again, here's another one with the irregular buckle. The Sacramento letter that was sent in 1986 and confirmed by Tarrance Pascal with me, that was in fact authenticated as a Zodiac communication. We can see again that small overhang that occurs on the stem, and the stem that actually protrudes from the bottom. In the similarities of the B's that I found was interesting enough is that every time he wrote the FBI, we saw this formation of the B. And that happened in the Scorpion letters, which were written to John Walsh. It happened in the John Benet Ramsey letter. Let's see if we can find that in any of these others. No, but I also wanted to point out that even in the Bruce Ivans, where we see this very skinny, streamlined letter B, Jack has that also in his arsenal up here. Now, these tend to be a little more upright, but I'm just saying, as far as the streamline and skinniness of it goes, again, it's a form that is not often used by Jack. So that would definitely be, in my mind, where he would go to, because he wouldn't want to show these guys. He wouldn't want to write here, because if you use this, that's obviously natural handwriting that could be identified fairly easy. But what he doesn't seem to realize is that he does actually use the forms that he's disguising in his handwriting. And even on this last B in Bruce Ivans, again, we have that irregular buckle that is occurring there that we saw up in Jack's handwriting. So for the most part, I found that the letter B's were just spot on. We can cross-reference them back and forth between Jack and the other communications that we've been talking about. In the realm of the lowercase b, this is Jack's standard B up here that we see. And he starts at the top, draws down all in one stroke, and ends right there. And we can see that occurring here again as well. Some of the more copybook or printed B's that I've seen is right here with Jack's handwriting. And then, of course, we're back to this one that has a curvature in the actual spine. And again, in one full stroke completes. And we can see that happening several times. Now, when we got into the Kern, the 1948 murder of Kern, which was a real estate agent, these particular B's started to pop out, which had very tall stems, very straight stems, and even attempt to sway that stem backwards. And we know that this is a disguise because we see that the author is attempting to change their slant and appearance. So they went from completely straight to backwards left, which tells me somebody is manipulating their handwriting. And we can also see that they're doing it in two strokes based on that particular letter B right there. So that is attempting to manipulate handwriting, because clearly a single stroke is going to be much quicker to write than a two-part or two-stroke letter. And so when we start to line these up and look at them in comparison to others, we only had one B in the Oswald letter. And I'm not sure if I made any relation to that one in here, but we can probably go through and see many other B's in here that are pretty much made exactly the same way. In fact, it is very similar to the Albany, New York, with the exception of the bowl. We have that slant of the stem that goes to the right, and we have a very tall stem with a smaller bowl. But when you start to get into things like the Dear Draft Board letter, again, we have more consistencies with the Oswald letter and the Dear Draft Board. When we get into the Zodiac, we start to see these two-stroke B's again, which again, that's going to printing and using more strokes than necessary to disguise one's handwriting is going to be the go-to. But when I started to even compare those particular types of handwriting to Jack's handwriting, we can actually see that there are similarities that are occurring inside of these particular letter B's. The Fairfield letters, again, the two-stroke obviously gives away the fact the person is attempting to manipulate their handwriting. And then we have this one version that actually looks or appears to have been a single stroke structure, which is exactly how we expect it to occur in Jack's handwriting. The SLA was not a good version, but we can see that the SLA B's are very consistent with other known Zodiac B's, which are throughout. The 1974 Citizen letter was probably some of the most natural formed B's that I've seen in all of the communications. So I pulled several of those out just so that we can actually show you what that looks like. But we look at that in comparison to Jackson. Oh my gosh, you guys, it's absolutely dead on. There's just nothing different about it, including this angularity that happens at the top of the bowl here that we can see occurring in Jack's. And that angular notion could actually be pointed outward, as we see in this one here, or it can be pointed upward, as we see here. So very, very consistent. Now, the Channel 9 newsletter, it looks like he tried to use a single stroke and he actually just did it in an opposite fashion, but we do know that that communication is related to the Zodiac, so we can count on that. We did see this particular letter B here, which I was able to, I think that one related back to not only not only the Zodiac, but also to, let's see here. So the Sacramento letters are consistent. That's the Riverside Phantom letter. So again, everything with a star, all Zodiac, all one person. We can see all the different variations that the killer used. And we can see now when we cross-reference those back, like the 1986 letter, these Bs are extremely consistent with the Bs that are actually found. So this B right here in the Scorpion letter is very consistent, if not almost identical to the Sacramento letter. We get down into the John Benet Ramsey, and once again, we have extreme similarities with that angularity at the top of the B that could either point outward or upward. So we see a very good consistency there. The Vowinovich is more like, what's that?
The John Benet all look disguised.
Yeah, they are definitely, I mean, every single one of these in my sense are disguised with the exception of the Citizen letter, Tom Voigt, and of course, Jack's. We've got his natural handwriting, but look at this particular B right here in Tom Voigt's and look at the B up here in Jack's. Look at this B here and look at that B up there. We also have that curved stem that comes over across the top. So again, we have extreme consistencies. And when you cross-reference the disguised handwriting with the other disguised handwriting, you start to find and see little things like this particular B right here in Tim Miller is very consistent with the Bs in the Scorpion. So as you cross-reference them back and forth, you start to see that the disguise is definitely used from one communication to the next, but he hasn't changed really the effort in changing the look of that letter. So he's consistently using the same disguise. I mean, even in
the Tim Miller looked like the Herb Cain as well.
Right, exactly. If you just look back and forth between them, you can easily make the references and see that we're dealing with one person for sure. And everybody keep in mind the Tim Miller letter that we keep discussing is where I found that this is where the big aha that the Zodiac was so much more than just the Zodiac, because he took credit for, in my opinion, he took credit for the Anthrax, for the different phantoms like Texarkana Phantom, the Freeway Phantom in DC. He took credit for all kinds of different crime sprees, the I-45 killings, what he referred to as the 80s series. So evidently there was a couple different series, and I can actually relate those series back to when Jack was in Texas. So it makes sense that Jack still fits the proximity for all of these crimes. In the letter C's, Jack has a habit of doing this curved letter or curved entrance stroke, or this curly Q that happens inside of the C. And we see sometimes he has this very angular looking C that's almost square. He has these big wide mouth C's that I talk about. He has the more short truncated where the overhang comes down into the C. And we also see these angular C's where it looks almost like a greater than less than sign, if you will. Here's another version of that square C, and here's another version of the angular C. Here's another version of the wide mouth C. Here's the long C. Now, if everybody can identify with the Riverside Phantom letter, that one holds the very elongated and more straight lined C's. He also has the square version of the C, which we found in his military pictures. So if we start with the 1946 lipstick killer letters, not only do we see the curvature or this curly Q that happens on the inside of it, but we also see kind of that elongated exit stroke where it's not exactly round and it points more to the ground than it does to come out and across the baseline. But then as I got into Elizabeth Short, we started to see these C's, the wide mouth C, just as I had indicated before over here. We have this very irregular kind of squarish C, which is more like this one here. We can see that the angle points are hitting in the same area. Down here at the bottom is where it actually turns direction again. And then go ahead.
The last few of Elizabeth Short look like they're trying to be disguised.
Well, we have the square C. I actually found a new communication in the Elizabeth Short, which was mailed to the sheriff's department, and we had this square C which we know that is in Jack's arsenal. This, so yeah, we do have these ones that are more, not this, I don't know if I'll call this the wide mouth. I'm going to call this more the elongated C because it's not quite round. If it was set by itself without any context, to me, it looks more like a parentheses than it does an actual letter C. But yes,
I think
the other
point out that the lipstick murders happened in Chicago. Elizabeth Short came to LA from Chicago. She's the Black Dahlia, of course. Jack was in Chicago. Jack knew her. And
she supposedly went to Chicago to watch the Bill Hirons trial with someone named Jack. He was purportedly a photographer, which we know that Jack was huge into photography, had his own darkroom. So yes, there is some consistency there with that. Look at these here, Sorry Mary C's. These C's from 1947, and this letter was supposedly where the killer had claimed he hadn't been caught for killing Black Dahlia, and now he was committing suicide. The letter was stuck in some clothes left by the beach as if he took his clothes off and walked away into the ocean. So look at these letter C's in comparison to the Zodiac C's.
Yes. Also, as far as Black Dahlia goes, she wasn't the only young woman killed in LA at that time.
Oh no, we have many. We've already covered the Black Dahlia era on killings. Absolutely, there was numerous women that were killed during that time frame, and all of the MOs seem to be relatively similar. And he tried to make it appear as though he had sexually assaulted them with something, but it was not a sexual crime in nature. So there's definitely something more behind that.
And
when I got into
link it to Chicago as well,
yes,
things like that.
Yep. Yeah, with the Degnan versus Hoover, Hollywood Boulevard. Degnan's body parts were found on Hollywood Boulevard, and Black Dahlia's parts were found on Degnan or near Degnan Boulevard. Like it's crazy the consistency. When I got into the Oswald letter, we started to see this attempt at curling in, once again, the top portion of that C, and we can see that that is definitely something that's within the realm of Jack. Now we have more of that angular C that we were talking about, which is found here, and it even has that little entrance stroke that we see that's happening up here in Jack's handwriting. The Sherry Jo Bates, this particular C right here, I found was definitely consistent with the styles of C's that are found up here. Let me see, where did you go? I want to say that is probably the form that I was looking at, even though this one's kind of cocked forward and rounded and has this tick mark at the top. We can see that he obviously can remove. Oh, here we go. So Dear Draft Board letter, look at these C's. So not just Sherry Jo Bates, but the 1968 Dear Draft Board letter C's are consistent. Here's one of those C's that I believe are more square in nature, which we see that Jack has those going on. Here is more, when I started to look at these C's too, I started to see this little curvature that happened, this uplift on this stroke that is exiting the C. So it's not really coming back around in a curved manner like you'd expect to see. It's kind of wavering out there with this little bit of a curvature in it. Now that's something we can see happening in Jack's handwriting as well. So that little curvature that happens there instead of it rounding itself out and upward. So as we go through more of these C's, you can start to see the consistencies between them. Again, we already talked about these ones. Here's that more of the greater than, less than sign that we started to see in Jack's handwriting. And then, of course, overall in the Zodiac, we also had the square C that popped up. So now we've seen the square C in Elizabeth Short, in the Zodiac Killer, and in Jack's handwriting. The Fairfield C is exactly, pretty much completely similar and consistent with the other C's that we've seen so far. We do have the C that looks like it's going to tip over and fall over on its face. To me, this is more of these wide mouth C's, if you will, that are larger in notion with not as much curvature on top or on the bottom. We'll see those. D.B. Cooper also had a square C. So, what are the chances that the individual is going to continually use the same type of disguise? Once again, we have these square C's that keep popping up. We also had this curvature with the inner loop of a C in the DB Cooper, which again, that takes us back to things like the Lipstick Killer and Jack's handwriting. One of the things that I noticed that just absolutely blew my mind is that one of the signatures in the DB Cooper case had a long draw-in that started from the left at the baseline, draws upward into the C. We see that this is that actual tick mark that we see that's happening right here. It comes down and then it works its way back around. Now, in the Sherry Jo Bates Riverside Press letter, or Enterprise letter, we saw the same exact movement. So we have this long draw-in on this letter E as it comes up and around. And not only is the actual slant of that draw-in fairly similar between each other, it just kind of blew my mind that we were seeing it in more than one communication. In the DB Cooper, or to continue with the DB Cooper, we started to see C's that were more consistent with what we've been looking at in Jack's handwriting and in the Zodiac's handwriting. So we started to see, again, this more angular, greater than, less than sign style C. Albany, New York even had slight curvatures on the entrance stroke, which is, again, we've already talked about that, very similar up here to the Oswald letter. And then the SLA, we see our first very straightened and elongated C, which is found right there in Jack's handwriting, where the C on the bottom does not actually finish itself off. It stops short to the left. That's exactly what occurred here. This particular C here, again, is more consistent with what we're seeing. It's an identified letter as the Zodiac, so we know that. Citizen letter, again, wide. Channel 9 newsletter, we start to see, again, this square or angular notion of a C that we see in Jack's handwriting. Also, the C's that are more consistent with what's going on in the Zodiac. The Riverside Phantom also had these very long C's that start with the entrance stroke. And of course, these ones here are extremely similar to what we were looking at in this elongated version of Jack's handwriting. Herb Cain had the wide mouth. I have now convinced myself I'm only up to the lowercase H in the handwriting samples, and I am now convinced that both Herb Cain letters have been written by the Zodiac. So whoever decided that one was a forgery was either trying to deter the public or just trying to make waves to sell some newspapers. I'm not sure, because both these letters were absolutely written by the Zodiac. The Atlanta, Georgia C's, I did find a consistency between those, and let's see if I can figure out where this facing downward C is kind of something that I notated for Jack. A lot of his letters always look like they were falling over. This could have been due to his mindset, being on drugs or otherwise, like not really particularly caring that the letter is going in the same direction with the rest of the letters that are in the word. But we can see in several cases that C appears as though it's falling over onto its right side. Atlanta, Georgia, again, we have these great big, huge, wide C's that are consistent with the Zodiac. So I'm convinced now that the Atlanta, Georgia murders, or at least the communications, were absolutely written by the Zodiac Killer. And then we have, again, that curvature that occurs at the bottom of the C. So the top of this portion of the C is quite like what we see going on up here in these more longer C's, but the bottom portion is what we see in these more truncated and shorter C's. The Christmas card in 1990, again, nice big wide open mouth C is very consistent with what I've been showing you. We see it also happen in the Scorpion letter. So here's another communication that's very close in time frame. 1990 for the Christmas card, 1991 for the Scorpion, and our C's are absolutely identical in form. John Benet Ramsey. This is the only capital C that I found in that writing, but we can now see that that is very consistent with DB Cooper, with Zodiac Killer, with the Scorpion C's. And then getting down into the Anthrax, once again, I'm not let down. We are seeing the big, huge, wide mouth C's and these pretty much these more angular, squatty C's. Looking at Tom Voight's, we find actually that nothing is really concealed at this point. It does not appear that he is attempting to hide how he writes at all. So we're seeing many similarities and consistencies. In fact, this one up here is pretty much this one here without the continuation of the bottom, but we can see how the rest of these C's are also falling in line with what we have going on in the Zodiac as well. So again, another comparison there. Now here's again that's straightened out C or opened up C form that we found. Let's see, where did we find you at? There in Elizabeth Short. No curvatures. Let's see. Fairly consistent with this one, only this one has an overhang. Oh, goodness. We did not make it as far as I thought. We've got 5 minutes left here. Let's see what we can get through. Now, the Oakland County child murders were the only C's that I felt the killer had stepped out of the range or done something different that we hadn't seen before, though we do know that this particular tick mark is something you can find all day long in Jack's handwriting, but he showed the use of one up from the bottom, but he also did that up from the bottom tick mark on his square C's as well. So I'm not going to put that one out of the range. And I found so many other letters in the OCCK that are identifiable absolutely 100% without disguise, that are a match to this particular series of communications and Jack's handwriting. So it didn't really bother me that he attempted to use yet another style, because we know the Zodiac had lots of styles in his arsenal. The lowercase c, I'm going to put this one up here for a minute, just kind of basically go over the fact I did not notate this one as heavily because now we're just looking at a smaller version of the C. But as you go back and forth between these, you can also see that we're dealing with extremely similar forms, from Tom Voigt's writing to John Benet's particular letter C's. Again, we have the C that does not finish out at the bottom. It stops short without a curvature. Again, looking like it's falling over. We've got that greater than, less than version. All of the C's in the Voinovich, which is a senator who lost his daughter during the primaries, just like Senator Percy, we can see are consistent with the Scorpion C's, consistent with the Sacramento C's, consistent with the Herb Cain C's. So as you go back and forth through these, you can take some time, put this on pause, and then take a look at these and just go back and forth. Look down here in the Tim Miller, one of the lowercase C's again was that very elongated C. And we can see it happening in Bruce Ivins as well. So it continually happens. The form and the shape is there. Here's again in the Channel 9 newsletter, one of those C's that look like it's falling over, doesn't finish out on the bottom. Again, that greater than, less than sign of a C. All of them extremely consistent with one another. Our letter D's kind of had some of the same premise that the B's did, and that was the stem that stuck down or protruded from the bottom. We can see that happening in the Elizabeth Short letters. As we go through, we see this form, or this where the bowl of the D actually wraps back, does not touch the top of the stem, and it actually crosses back to the left, surpassing the stem on the left. And we're going to see again that upper part where it doesn't necessarily happen on the bottom, but definitely happens on the top. That's consistent. I found that the French letter D was extremely consistent to what Jack had going on. When we get into some of the more disguise, like these are probably more attempts at being copybook disguise. But when you look at these in comparison to other, like the Dear Sorry Mary letter, they're very, very consistent between one another. So we know that both of these communications, from Elizabeth Short and the Dear Mary letter, was definitely written by the same individual. Now the question is can that be cross-referenced to other crimes? And as you go through these and start to look at these, we have what I refer to as kind of this square D. So it's kind of like the C, only backwards, but we have this kind of angular point here and down here. We can see that that is definitely something that is occurring in Jack's own handwriting. The D's over here, not only do they surpass the stem to the left-hand side, but they also protrude from the bottom, just as we saw in Elizabeth Short, and this is Sherry Jo Bates. So again, we have consistencies there. We started to see these very thin streamline D's, which again we can find in the Dear Draft Board. It looks like that's about all the time we're going to have for today, you guys. I didn't make it as far along as I wanted to. Hopefully next week we don't need to talk about any summary briefs or anything else, and we can hop directly into the handwriting. Let's go back to Nolan and I. Is there anything you'd like to add? It looks like we have a few seconds here before we're off air.
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
So it's looking pretty darn good, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Well, the further you go into the alphabet, the more similarities you see, but at different times and different eras, there's different comparisons between certain certain killings and certain letters.
Correct. I mean, if I went all the way down here into Atlanta, Georgia, we see the D that's been used up here in French. Absolutely, 100%. Once again, and definitely a D that's within Jack's arsenal. Now the bold point's a little bit more forward, but we can see that occurring in some of his letters as well. He isn't necessarily just an upward bold person. He can also write it outward to the right. So yeah, it depending on the time frame and how he's feeling, I find that there is a definite consistency between the communications in the disguise that's being used. I mean, these D's that are up here in Elizabeth Short, they're down here in the Anthrax, but this is like nearly 60 years later or less than 60 years later, but we're seeing the same style and form that's being used for sure.
And it's amazing how often there's a lot of attempts to disguise.
Correct. All right, you guys. Well, everybody have a wonderful weekend. Happy St. Patty's Day. I forgot to mention that. So for everybody who's Irish or loving the Irish, go get your green beer. Have your, what is that? Corned beef and cabbage. Yep. Have a great weekend, Nolan. We'll see you guys next week. Thank you.
You.